So far, we've talked about media studies, mostly in the United States and the United Kingdom. What are the views of media that emerge from scholars who've been looking at the advent of globalization and media from other parts of the world? Now, by the 1960s or so, scholars from the newly liberated, decolonized nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America began to express their concerns that the emerging global media corporations, for example, Hollywood, uh, were bringing about a form of neo-colonialism. In a way, they were starting to colonize these nations which had fought so hard for their freedom from Spain and Portugal and England in the past. Uh, and a lot of work has been done since then on the role of global media in bringing about a condition which some scholars might call neo-colonialism. So there are two broad streams of research that we can talk about briefly today. Starting in the 1970s or so, scholars in the field of international communication research started to map out what communication or information flows look like between different countries. Okay. So for example, they would look at the data each year on, say, how many movies from the United States would be imported by other countries in the world and vice versa. And it's very easy for you to even picture this. If you've traveled anywhere around the world recently, well, most of us haven't, but say whenever you were last traveling around the world, if you look at the bestseller lists in bookshops, regardless of whether you're in Asia or Europe or or North America, you will find there are at least some titles, some authors whose books are all around the world. They might be translated into local languages, but all the same, you're going to see Harry Potter, you're going to see some other non-fiction and fiction bestsellers in almost every country that you go to. But if you were to stop and find out who the most popular writers in one particular country are, and then go back to another, say the US or UK, and see if you find those authors in your bookstores, chances are you may not find them. Now, same thing with movies. A big Hollywood production is released and watched all around the world, but a movie that comes out of, say, a film studio in India or in Nigeria, as big as those film industries are, might not have the same mainstream reception, say, in the US or UK or in Europe. Now, often people think that the reason for this is just a language gap or a cultural gap, but when you look at this critically, you can see that this is because of a very long history, which today we call globalization and earlier was called colonialism. Starting in the 1500s or so until the present, most of the world was essentially captured and turned into colonies for a handful of colonial nations. And the handful of media corporations that dominate the world today, whether it's Disney or Viacom or Netflix or Amazon or the Silicon Valley companies, these are literally just a handful of owners, cultural owners, who are disseminating their point of view to billions and billions of people. Now, people argue that, with social media, anybody can make their own video and put it on YouTube or blog about it or tweet about it. But that is a very, very optimistic and sometimes even naive view, because at the end of the day, what we are witnessing is a global media condition emerging. It was already getting into place because of colonialism, and now because of this new technology like phones and the internet, more and more people around the world are essentially being captured into a sort of a mental, sensorial, colonized condition. So there's a couple of issues of key ideas and issues I would like us to just think about to understand the global condition we're in as far as media is concerned. The first is a classic work called How to Read Donald Duck, which was published, I believe, in the early 80s by Ariel Dorfman and Armand Martelat. Take a look at this amazing cover picture. So you can see Scrooge McDuck in the form of, I guess, the US, taking money out of Southern Latin America, putting it into the bank. So this is a very interesting study which combined the semiotic, cultural studies, meaning-making points of view with the broader global anti-colonial economic perspective to argue that the stories that children were growing up with reading Disney comics were normalizing essentially a imperial or neo-imperial condition. So this is one good example of global media studies, which helps us understand the realities, both culturally and politically, that have brought us all together. It's highly, highly unequal. Another important book, a more recent one, is this one, The Global Media, The New Missionaries of Corporate Capitalism by Herman and McChesney. So this maps out, again, this sort of a global condition that we have today where most of the world's stories and representations about themselves are coming from a handful of gigantic, powerful, monopoly corporations, again, most of them based in the West, but also available for, big capital purchase by interests from other parts of the world. So we are going through a very, very challenging time as far as, the global picture on media is concerned. The future of media studies as far as globalization is concerned, I'll talk about it a little more in the next video, but just one more concept I wanted us to be familiar with as far as global media and culture is concerned. It's this book called Orientalism by Edward Said. This was written in 1978 and it had a huge influence on many, many fields of study. And Said basically looks at the kind of stereotypes or representations of the other, particularly of the Arab and Muslim world, that were created by Britain and France in the heyday of colonialism. And this has also proved to be a very useful concept in understanding that the concern about globalization and media today is not only economic, it's not only technological, it's also cultural and epistemological. Okay? In other words, when you have a small group of global media elites, both in Western countries and also in the capitals of other countries who've been trained in a very westernized, colonial sort of way of looking at their own cultures and people, what we end up with is a very, very dismal situation as far as the future of culture is concerned, the future of even freedom is concerned, because more and more young people around the world, maybe they may be growing up in India or Indonesia or Kenya or South Africa or Mexico or Peru, but the stories that they get about their own selves are going to be increasingly located not in their own elders' traditions and cultures and ways of looking at the world, but really from the sort of deracinated, mercenary offices of these big media corporations, whether they're based in Hollywood or in, New Delhi or Mumbai, doesn't matter. So some of the key concepts, again, in global media studies to recap: colonialism, neocolonialism, the one-way flow of communication, the fact that most media, whether it's publishing or music or cinema, tends to flow from the wealthier nations to the rest of the world. And then the cultural impact of all of this, the problem of Orientalism, and what some scholars are calling re-Orientalism or self-Orientalism, where at a nominal level, you might have, Asian or African or Latin American movie makers or novelists telling stories about themselves, but then the lens with which they view themselves is so colonial, it's so imported and doesn't resonate with the masses of their own peoples. So again, you sort of see this inequality that's playing out at the representational level and, of course, at the political and economic level. So the global media picture is sort of where we are at right now in media studies. And in the last video, which is the next one, I want to talk a little bit about some global problems and challenges in terms of media studies and the future.